Hello, we will now begin the graduate seminar for Week 10, focusing on Chapter 9, The Rhetoric of the Catholic Epistles, Part 1. Welcome back, scholars. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the core arguments and in-depth textual analysis of our seminar series, focusing heavily on the rhetorical milieu of James, sapiential and Septuagintal influences. Let us anchor our discussion with a foundational observation from our academic text. The Greek of James has perhaps been underappreciated. Luke Timothy Johnson is even prepared to go so far as to say it rivals the polish and occasionally the eloquence of Hebrews. Now, when we pause to truly dissect this statement, we realize it challenges centuries of marginalization. Historically, the Epistle of James was often sidelined or considered somewhat simplistic, a mere practical collection of moral directives. However, an advanced rhetorical criticism entirely overturns that outdated assumption. The Greek construction is incredibly refined, demonstrating a high level of classical education and acute rhetorical awareness. The author is not merely stringing together random ethical maxims, rather, he is deploying a highly sophisticated linguistic framework that resonates deeply with audiences accustomed to elevated, persuasive discourse. By recognizing the eloquence of the text, we must approach James not as a haphazard letter, but as a meticulously constructed rhetorical masterpiece designed for maximum impact. Moving forward to our next point of analysis, we must consider the specific flavor and origin of this masterful language. The detailed examination of the Greek of James leads to the conclusion that our author wrote this document originally in Greek, and it shows familiarity with the LXX, and seems especially indebted to Sirach and Wisdom of Solomon, as well as the LXX of Proverbs. This is a profound insight that firmly roots the epistle within the sapiential tradition of early Judaism. The author is actively functioning as a Christian sage, drawing heavily upon the rich, deep reservoir of Hellenistic Jewish wisdom literature. The fact that the text was originally composed in Greek, yet is heavily saturated by the translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, creates a highly unique stylistic synthesis. It possesses a distinctively Semitic resonance while maintaining the fluidity of Hellenistic Greek. By weaving in themes and stylistic echoes from Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon, the author aligns himself with the great wisdom teachers of the past. He leverages this authoritative tradition to speak directly to the lived realities of diaspora Jewish Christians. The rhetorical strategy here is absolutely brilliant. By using familiar, authoritative, and revered literary forms, the author maximizes the persuasive power of his message. The audience would immediately recognize these sapiential echoes and grant the speaker the ethos of a revered sage. Thus, the rhetoric of James is deeply embedded in a milieu that honors the ancient wisdom of Israel while skillfully utilizing the persuasive tools of the broader Greco-Roman world. Let us continue our deep dive into the text by focusing on the use of enthymemes in James's exhortation. We begin our analysis by looking at the specific logical structures the author employs. As we have already seen in our study of the pastoral epistles, the enthymeme was a frequent rhetorical form of argumentation used by early Christians, a form that involves an incomplete syllogism. To unpack this fully, we must understand what an enthymeme actually is. It is essentially an ethical argument in shorthand. In classical rhetoric, an enthymeme is a syllogism where one of the premises is deliberately suppressed or left unstated because the speaker knows that the audience already shares that premise. It is a highly effective way of preaching to the choir. It respects the intelligence of the listeners, actively engaging their minds as they internally supply the missing logical step to complete the argument. By utilizing this technique, James creates a deeply interactive and participatory rhetorical environment, binding his audience closer to his theological and ethical conclusions. This brings us to how these logical structures appear in the text itself. What is notable about these imperatives is that usually they do not stand in isolation but are accompanied by explanations, warrants, or purpose clauses. Notice as well that there are clear signals that these imperatives do not stand alone but are part of a larger argument. This observation is absolutely critical for understanding the macrostructure of the homily. James is famous for his high density of commands. Out of 108 verses, there are 59 imperatives. A casual reader might look at this and mistakenly conclude that the book is just a chaotic list of disjointed orders. However, rhetorical analysis proves the exact opposite. These commands are meticulously tethered to theological explanations, purpose clauses, and causal conjunctions. They are the punchlines of these abbreviated syllogisms. The author is engaging in deliberative rhetoric, aiming to alter or reinforce the future behavior of his audience. He is not merely barking orders, he is persuading his listeners by rooting his exhortations in shared community values and divine wisdom. Recognizing this enthymematic argumentation allows us to see the profound theological architecture that supports every single ethical command in the epistle. Moving forward in our textual analysis, we must now examine diatribe style and imaginary interlocutors in James. The author's pedagogical strategy is incredibly dynamic, as evidenced by this key insight from our text. At times James even breaks into what could be called diatribe style, and even speech in character, for example when our author allows those Christians who practice discrimination in the Christian community, or those who refuse to help the needy, or those who have faith but no deeds, or those who boast of future plans to speak briefly for themselves. Here, we encounter the brilliant use of prosopopia, or speech in character. This was a highly advanced technique taught in Greco-Roman rhetorical schools. By giving voice to a hypothetical opponent or a misbehaving community member, James makes the ethical failing vivid and undeniable. It is a theatrical and engaging way to highlight absurdity. When the author puts words into the mouth of the person turning away the poor, the audience is forced to hear how hollow and hypocritical that behavior truly sounds. This diatribe style transforms a static ethical lecture into a vibrant, dramatic confrontation. The audience is no longer just passively listening, they are witnessing a live debate where the wrong path is exposed and systematically dismantled. This naturally leads to the author's next interactive strategy. Not only do we have the imaginary interlocutor in the diatribe style in James, but we have the typical posing of pithy direct questions which are instantly answered, as well as the posing of numerous rhetorical questions to draw the audience into thinking like the author does. The use of rhetorical questions is a staple of persuasive speech. James fires off clusters of these questions to corner his listeners logically. By asking a question where the answer is so incredibly obvious, the author effectively forces the audience to agree with his premise before he even explicitly states it. It is a method of guiding the audience's internal reasoning process. When James asks, "Can faith save you?" in the context of a lack of deeds, the immediate, inescapable internal response of the listener is, "No." This technique strips away the audience's defenses and aligns their perspective with the author's uncompromising moral vision. It is aggressive, it is brilliant, and it is the hallmark of a master rhetorician fiercely committed to the spiritual integrity of his congregation. Our next slide brings us to the sensory experience of the text, exploring oral and oral rhetorical devices, rhythm, rhyme, and alliteration. We have to recalibrate our modern reading habits to fully grasp the nature of this document, as our academic source points out. Equally clearly, this hortatory discourse is one which was meant to be heard, drawing on a full range of oral and oral rhetorical devices. For example, rhythm and rhyme are readily used, and James clearly has a strong penchant for alliteration, particularly on the P sound, or the D sound, or the K sound, to mention but a few examples. In the ancient Mediterranean world, texts were almost exclusively experienced orally. They were written to be performed. When we simply read James silently on a page, we miss an enormous dimension of its persuasive power. The author intentionally crafted sentences with rhythmic cadences, striking rhymes, and heavy alliteration. These sonic elements were not just decorative flair, they served crucial rhetorical functions. They captured the listener's attention, emphasized critical theological points, and made the ethical teachings highly memorable. A congregation hearing these rhythmic, alliterative phrases would find the teachings sticking in their minds long after the public reading concluded. This brings us to the profound realization about the document's overall intent. This is a document meant to be read aloud to good rhetorical effect, or better said, it is meant to be delivered or performed in a rhetorically effective manner. Of the some 560 words in this discourse, 60 are not found elsewhere in the New Testament. Our author certainly is not just repeating what he has heard before. He is a master of his source material. The presence of such a high number of unique words, or hapax legomena, shatters the notion that James is just a derivative compilation. The author is a creative linguistic architect. He is actively forging new vocabulary and molding the Greek language to serve his precise homiletical purposes. The requirement for this to be an oral performance means that the original reader, or lector, would have used voice modulation, gestures, and dramatic pauses to bring the text to life. It was an auditory event designed to deeply move and challenge the gathered assembly. Recognizing this performative nature is absolutely essential for interpreting the intense, emotional, and persuasive energy that pulses through every single chapter of the Epistle of James. Let us shift our focus to the structural framework of the epistle, specifically catchword connections and structural cohesion in James. There has been significant scholarly debate regarding how the various sections of James hold together, as our reading notes. Much has been made of the use of catchword connection in James, such that separate statements are linked on the basis of catchwords. This has sometimes led to the conclusion that these statements are only linked because they involve similar catchwords or phrases. Dibelius for example concluded, that there is no continuity of thought in such material. For the most part this conclusion is false as it is applied to James. For many decades, the towering influence of Martin Dibelius led scholars to view James as a disjointed collection of parienetic snippets, held together merely by superficial verbal hooks. However, a rigorous rhetorical analysis completely dismantles this perspective. While James absolutely utilizes catchwords, a standard mnemonic device in ancient oral literature, these verbal links are not a substitute for logic, they are the glue that binds a highly cohesive argument. The repetition of key terms guides the listener's ear from one logical step to the next, ensuring that the transitions are smooth and memorable. The structure is deeply intentional. This leads us to a more accurate understanding of the text's complexity. In the majority of cases there is a connection of sense as well as sound and key words in such linked materials, but the audience is sometimes expected to supply the missing premise in the enthymeme. For example, this text presupposes the ability to pick up allusions to earlier sapiential material, the ability to understand how such sapiential material functions in deliberative rhetoric as part of argumentation by exhortation. The author of James is demanding a high level of cognitive engagement from his audience. He assumes they are thoroughly educated in the Septuagint and the Jesus tradition. The continuity of thought exists, but it requires the listener to actively bridge the gaps using their shared theological framework. The catchwords serve as signals for profound thematic shifts and structural developments within the deliberative rhetoric. This means James is not a scattered list of proverbs, but a tightly woven, complex tapestry of ethical argumentation. To miss this is to entirely underestimate the brilliant, underlying logic of the homily and the sophisticated intelligence of both the author and the original Christian communities he was addressing. Now we turn to the rich imagery of the text in vivid comparisons and syncresis in sapiential rhetoric. James is arguably the most visually evocative book in the New Testament epistles. Our text provides a brilliant analysis of this. Our author is known for his vivid language, especially his vivid comparisons, using the rhetorical device known as syncresis. His use of analogies is most frequently brought forth to show what behavior is bad or forbidden or even evil, whether the comparison is with a wave whipped up by the wind, foliage that withers in the sun, a raging fire in a forest, fresh or brackish water and the like. The rhetorical technique of syncresis, or comparison, is central to ancient pedagogy. While other authors might use comparison to show that one good thing is slightly better than another, James uses extreme, shocking contrasts. He draws heavily from the natural world, the chaotic sea, the scorching desert sun, an uncontrollable wildfire, to graphically illustrate the catastrophic consequences of unethical behavior. By comparing the destructive power of the human tongue to a raging forest fire set ablaze by hell itself, James forces his audience to confront the horrific reality of their community divisions. These are not gentle pastoral suggestions, they are aggressive, visceral warnings designed to jar the audience out of spiritual complacency and provoke immediate behavioral change. This visual intensity is a hallmark of his specific wisdom style. Sapiential rhetoric is often compressed into pithy or even paradoxical maxims with brief support in order that they be both memorable and memorizable. The implications require a certain unpacking, and the density of the ideas is deliberate to force meditation and reflection. James operates as a true master of sapiential rhetoric. He delivers highly compressed, incredibly dense nuggets of wisdom. Because these maxims are so short and striking, they are easily memorized by an oral culture. However, their brevity masks a profound theological depth. The author deliberately constructs these dense sayings so that the audience cannot simply hear them and move on. They are forced to chew on the words, to meditate on the underlying paradoxes, and to unpack the extensive ethical implications for their daily lives. It is an interactive, deeply reflective form of persuasion that demands ongoing spiritual and intellectual labor from the congregation. Let us now examine the broader structural architecture of the text in rhetorical elaboration in James, the Watson analysis. To truly appreciate the complexity of James, we must look at how scholars have mapped its arguments, as our textbook highlights. More compelling is the argument of D. F. Watson in two essays that the whole of James 2:1 through 3:12 must be seen as deliberative rhetoric meant to dissuade the audience from certain kinds of behavior and persuade them about others. Watson's groundbreaking analysis proves that James is operating at the highest levels of classical deliberative rhetoric. The author is not simply throwing together isolated ethical complaints. Instead, he is crafting sustained, highly focused arguments designed specifically to change the future actions of his congregation. Whether he is attacking the sin of showing favoritism to the rich, or dismantling the uselessness of a faith that produces no action, James is engaged in a systematic process of persuasion and dissuasion. He is aggressively addressing a community in crisis, aiming to align their sociological behavior with their stated theological beliefs. We can see this precision in how he structures these sections. In fact, Watson is able to demonstrate that the author is following a rhetorical pattern for elaboration in detail in each case, as follows: propositio, ratio, confirmatio, exornatio. This is where the sheer genius of the text becomes undeniable. Watson reveals that these chapters perfectly mirror the classical Greco-Roman handbook rules for rhetorical elaboration. James systematically states his thesis, known as the propositio. He then provides the rationale, the ratio, often using authoritative examples. He moves into confirmation, embellishment, and finally a concluding summary. This rigid, formal structuring proves that the author had received advanced rhetorical training. It completely destroys the old, lingering idea that early Christian documents were written by uneducated peasants who were unaware of formal literary conventions. By mapping James according to these classical models, we unlock the intense, logical rigor that drives the homily. We see exactly how the author intended his arguments to build momentum, systematically dismantling counterarguments and leading his audience to an inescapable moral verdict. Building on our structural analysis, we will now look at the entire book through the lens of James as a protreptic wisdom speech. Stepping back to view the macrostructure of the text provides incredible clarity, as noted by our academic source. E. Basland classifies the whole of this homily as deliberative rhetoric, a protreptic wisdom speech in letter form. He argues that the document does in fact conform overall to rhetorical structures as follows. The exordium introduces the two central themes of perseverance in trials in the practical areas of wisdom and speech, and money and action. The propositio is to accept and live by the word. Viewing James as a protreptic speech changes everything. A protreptic discourse is specifically designed to exhort an audience to adopt a new way of life or a specific philosophical path. Basland effectively maps the entire book onto a classical rhetorical outline. The exordium, or introduction, brilliantly sets the stage, previewing the two massive crises facing the community, the devastating misuse of speech and the corrupting influence of wealth. The central thesis, the propositio, is unmistakably clear. It is not enough to merely hear the divine word, one must actively and faithfully execute it. This structure proves that the epistle possesses a grand, unified architectural design from the very first verse. Let us look at how this grand design resolves itself. The argumentatio develops the two themes, supplying a climax dealing with both themes focusing on the rich man. The peroratio consists of recapitulatio or reiteration of themes, and a final exhortation. The main body of the letter, the argumentatio, meticulously alternates between attacking socio-economic injustice and condemning toxic community speech. It builds to a blistering, prophetic climax against the wealthy elite. Finally, the peroratio, the grand conclusion, brilliantly recaps the opening themes. It circles back to the necessity of patience, the danger of oaths, and the supreme power of prayer. This creates a stunning rondo effect, a cyclical returning to core motifs that binds the entire homily into a single, cohesive masterpiece of early Christian persuasion. The author is a master conductor, bringing all the thematic instruments together for a powerful, unforgettable finale. Now, we transition to explore the profound intertextuality of the epistle in James's integration of the Jesus tradition and Q sayings. The theological foundation of James is intimately tied to the teachings of Christ, as our research clearly demonstrates. More extensive are the parallels with the Matthean form of the Q sayings of Jesus we find in the Sermon on the Mount. These parallels rule out the earlier suggestions that this was not originally a Christian document, or was not very Christian in character. For a long time, liberal scholarship bizarrely attempted to argue that James was simply a Jewish moral tract that had the name of Jesus superficially pasted onto it later. However, rigorous comparative analysis obliterates that theory. The Epistle of James is absolutely saturated with the Jesus tradition. It profoundly echoes the ethical demands found in the Sermon on the Mount, specifically drawing from the early Q source material. The theology of James is deeply, irrevocably Christian. It represents a community that is striving to practically live out the radical, upside-down kingdom ethics inaugurated by Jesus of Nazareth. But the way James uses these teachings is highly unique. What we notice when analyzing these parallels more closely is several things. James rarely cites the saying of Jesus directly. Rather he weaves various ideas, themes, phrases into his own discourse. This material is then presented as the teaching of James, though one may suspect the audience would recognize the echoes. Here we witness the author operating in the highest tradition of an authoritative sage. James does not rely on formal citation formulas like, "as the Lord said." Instead, he completely absorbs the mind and theology of Christ, organically weaving these dominical teachings into his own parienetic discourse. He speaks with his own immense apostolic and familial authority. It is a brilliant rhetorical strategy. The audience, deeply familiar with the oral traditions of Jesus, would immediately hear the profound intertextual echoes resonating beneath the surface of James's words. By internalizing and representing the Jesus tradition, James proves that the gospel is not just a set of historical quotes to be recited, but a living, breathing ethical framework that must be continuously applied to the fresh crises facing the church. Finally, we turn our attention to the fiery, dramatic text of our second subject in the Rhetoric of Jude, apocalyptic prophecy and pseudepigrapha. Moving from James to Jude requires a complete shift in our literary expectations, as the textbook vividly points out. To say that Jude is a horse of a different color from James is to put things too mildly. It draws on a whole different sort of early Jewish literature, a prophetic, even an apocalyptic sort, including material from 1 Enoch. If James comes across as some kind of sage, Jude comes across as some kind of early Jewish prophet. While James grounds his rhetoric in the calm, measured tones of wisdom literature, Jude explodes onto the page with the intense, urgent energy of apocalyptic prophecy. Jude is confronting an immediate, existential threat to his community from dangerous false teachers. To combat this, he adopts the aggressive persona of an ancient prophet pronouncing divine judgment. He reaches deep into the reservoir of Jewish apocalyptic thought to find the most terrifying, cosmos-shaking imagery available to warn his congregation of the impending doom facing the infiltrators. This leads to one of the most controversial aspects of his rhetoric. Jude also feels free to use the pseudepigrapha, 1 Enoch, Testament of Moses, unlike James, but this was very common amongst Jews of this era. Jude's abundant use of scripture or apostolic citation followed by interpretation and application in a midrash pesher fashion. Jude does not restrict his authoritative proofs to what we now consider the canonical Old Testament. He freely utilizes pseudepigraphal texts, treating them as divinely inspired prophecy. This was completely acceptable in the fluid literary environment of first-century Judaism. But more importantly, we must note how he uses these texts. He employs the midrash pesher technique. This was a highly specific hermeneutical method, famously used by the Qumran community, where ancient prophecies are interpreted as speaking directly and exclusively to the author's immediate, contemporary situation. By declaring, "This is that," Jude violently yanks ancient apocalyptic judgments out of the past and hurls them directly at the false teachers sitting in the pews of his own church. It is a stunning, forceful use of sacred tradition designed to utterly annihilate the credibility of his opponents. Welcome back to our advanced seminar on New Testament rhetoric. Today, we turn our attention to the conclusion and application section of chapter 9, exploring the fascinating rhetorical landscape of the Catholic epistles, specifically James and Jude. Let us begin with our first major theme, the rhetorical landscape of James and Jude. Consider our first academic observation. The conclusion of our analysis of James and Jude reveals that these Catholic epistles are not mere compendiums of disjointed moral exhortations, but sophisticated works of deliberative rhetoric tailored for an oral performance. For centuries, scholars have frequently misunderstood these texts, particularly the Epistle of James, as a random assortment of proverbs, lacking any cohesive argumentative structure. However, when we apply the rigorous lens of ancient rhetorical analysis, a completely different picture emerges. We discover that these authors were master communicators who carefully designed their letters to be read aloud to an attentive congregation. This is the essence of an oral culture, where the spoken word carries immense power and authority. Furthermore, these epistles are prime examples of deliberative rhetoric. As we have discussed in previous sessions, deliberative rhetoric is fundamentally concerned with the future. Its primary goal is to persuade an audience to adopt a specific course of action or to alter their current behavior. Therefore, James and Jude are not merely dispensing abstract theological concepts, they are actively engaging their listeners, urging them to live differently in response to very specific, real-world challenges within their communities. Let us move to our second critical point. The overarching exigence addressed in both letters necessitates a homiletic approach designed to persuade audiences toward immediate behavioral modification. The term exigence refers to the urgent, driving problem or catalyst that compels the author to speak out. In the case of James, this exigence is the pervasive double-mindedness of the congregation and the destructive socio-economic conflicts dividing the rich and the poor. For Jude, the urgent crisis is the dangerous infiltration of false teachers threatening the community's theological and moral integrity. Because these problems are so acute, both authors adopt a homiletic approach, essentially delivering a passionate, urgent sermon rather than a dry letter. This preaching style is specifically calibrated to stir the heart, challenge the mind, and move the will, ultimately persuading the audience that immediate, tangible changes in their behavior are absolutely necessary to align with the truth of the gospel. Moving forward, we will delve into the specific techniques employed in the Epistle of James. Our next topic is James as wisdom discourse and rhetorical persuasion. Let us examine the first point of our analysis. James masterfully synthesizes Jewish wisdom traditions with Greco-Roman rhetorical conventions, particularly the diatribe, to confront the deeply rooted issue of double-mindedness, or dipsychos. This represents an incredible brilliance on the part of the author. On one hand, James is deeply anchored in the Jewish wisdom literature, drawing heavily on the teachings of Jesus, especially the Sermon on the Mount, and the profound insights of the book of Proverbs. But on the other hand, he packages this ancient wisdom using the cutting-edge persuasive tools of the Greco-Roman world. The most prominent of these tools is the diatribe. In the ancient world, a diatribe was a specific teaching method used by philosophers that involved a lively, interactive style where the speaker would argue with an imaginary opponent. By anticipating objections and vocalizing them through a hypothetical conversation partner, James keeps his audience intensely engaged and dismantles their counterarguments before they can even articulate them. This leads us directly to our second foundational quote. The rhetoric functions as a sharp mirror, compelling the audience to reconcile their professed faith with their pragmatic socio-economic behaviors. This concept of double-mindedness is the central exigence, or core problem, addressed in the letter. The Greek word dipsychos literally means two-souled. James is writing to a community of believers who are attempting to have it both ways. They claim to possess a saving faith in God, but they simultaneously strive to live according to the selfish, status-driven values of the secular world. They are showing blatant favoritism to the rich over the poor, engaging in destructive interpersonal conflicts, and failing to control their tongues. By utilizing rhetorical persuasion, James holds up an unyielding mirror to his congregation. He desperately wants them to recognize the ugly, hypocritical contradiction between their lofty theological claims and their actual, day-to-day lives. The ultimate goal of this deliberative discourse is entirely practical: to forge a unified, single-minded devotion to God that manifests itself in tangible, transformative acts of love, mercy, and social justice. We continue our exploration by looking at another highly effective rhetorical device utilized by James. The title for this section is The Role of Syncresis in James. Let us turn our attention to the first scholarly statement. A defining feature of James's deliberative strategy is the pervasive use of syncresis, or comparison, which establishes stark polarities, such as the rich versus the poor, and earthly wisdom versus heavenly wisdom. The term syncresis is absolutely fundamental to understanding ancient rhetorical strategies. It refers to a deliberate, and often extreme, contrasting of two distinct entities or concepts to conclusively demonstrate that one is vastly superior to the other. In the realm of deliberative rhetoric, where the primary objective is to persuade an audience to make a specific choice, syncresis is an incredibly potent weapon. By placing two diverging paths side by side and vividly illustrating the ultimate destiny of each, the speaker makes the correct moral choice blindingly obvious. James employs this technique with masterful precision throughout his epistle. He does not merely present a menu of varied options, rather, he presents a definitive fork in the road. Now, let us reflect on our second quote. By utilizing these extreme contrasts, the author forces a definitive ethical choice, leaving no middle ground for the audience and demanding absolute allegiance to God. Think about how James strategically structures his arguments to achieve this end. He sharply contrasts the arrogance and temporary, fading nature of the wealthy with the humble, enduring faithfulness of the poor, reminding his audience that God has specifically chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith. Later in the epistle, he presents a brilliant syncresis regarding the nature of wisdom itself. He describes a demonic, earthly wisdom that is driven by bitter envy and selfish ambition, inevitably leading to disorder and every evil practice. He then immediately contrasts this with the wisdom from above, which is pure, peace-loving, considerate, and full of mercy. By framing the world in these uncompromising, binary oppositions, James effectively eliminates any comfortable gray area. He is emphatically telling his double-minded audience that they cannot serve two masters. This demonstrates the raw power of rhetorical comparison. It does not merely inform the intellect, it completely corners the human will and demands an immediate, life-altering response. Let us now turn to the underlying logical architecture of James's epistle. The subject we are addressing is enthymemes and logical persuasion in James. Please direct your attention to our first analytical point. Beyond stylistic flourishes, James constructs robust logical arguments utilizing enthymemes, which are abbreviated syllogisms that invite the audience's mental participation. While we have discussed stylistic elements like diatribe and vivid imagery, it is crucial to recognize that James is also a master of structural logic. However, he does not rely on dry, overly formal logical proofs. Instead, he deploys a powerful rhetorical device known as an enthymeme. An enthymeme is essentially an incomplete argument or an abbreviated syllogism. In a classic, three-part syllogism, you have two premises that lead to a logical conclusion. But in an enthymeme, the speaker deliberately omits one of the premises, fully expecting that the audience will automatically fill in the missing information from their shared cultural or theological background. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its persuasive power. When the audience is required to do a portion of the mental work to connect the logical dots, they inherently take ownership of the conclusion. It feels as though they arrived at the undeniable truth themselves, rather than simply being lectured to. This brings us to the second key statement for this topic. By requiring the audience to supply the unstated cultural or theological premises, the rhetorical strategy makes the ultimate persuasive conclusion significantly more psychologically compelling. Let me provide a clear example of how this operates within the text. When James famously declares, "Faith without works is dead," he is utilizing an enthymematic structure. The unstated premise, which his Jewish Christian audience already implicitly accepted, is that a genuine, saving relationship with God naturally and inevitably produces a transformed life characterized by obedience and righteous deeds. James does not need to painstakingly spell out that theological foundation, he simply states the observable premise regarding their lack of works, and immediately delivers the devastating conclusion that their so-called faith is dead. By leaving that middle theological step unspoken, James forces his listeners to mentally supply the very doctrines they claim to believe, making his sharp critique of their hypocritical behavior incredibly psychologically compelling. It is a masterful technique that uses the audience's own foundational beliefs to persuade them to urgently repent and change their actions. We now shift our analytical focus to the second letter covered in our seminar. The topic is Jude's deliberative strategy and urgent exhortation. Let us review the first critical observation regarding this text. Turning to the Epistle of Jude, we encounter a compressed but fiercely intense deliberative discourse that responds to an immediate and catastrophic theological crisis. The Epistle of Jude is one of the shortest books in the entire New Testament, yet it delivers an astonishingly powerful rhetorical impact. It serves as the absolute epitome of an urgent, fiery, and uncompromising sermon. While the Epistle of James dealt with the slow, corrosive, and systemic problem of double-mindedness, Jude is responding to a five-alarm spiritual fire. His letter is a masterpiece of highly condensed deliberative rhetoric. He simply does not have the luxury of time for long, drawn-out philosophical or theological arguments. He urgently needs his audience to recognize a mortal threat in their midst and to take decisive action immediately. The sheer intensity of his vocabulary perfectly reflects the catastrophic severity of the crisis at hand. This profound urgency is captured in our second quote. Jude explicitly alters his original rhetorical intent, from writing a general treatise on salvation to issuing an urgent, polemical exhortation, apagonizesthai, to contend for the faith against internal subversion. This is one of the most fascinating and transparent aspects of Jude's entire letter. He actually reveals his own compositional process to the reader. In the third verse, he states that although he was very eager to write to them about the salvation they share, he suddenly felt compelled to write and urge them to contend for the faith. He had originally planned a calm, educational, and perhaps epideictic letter celebrating their shared beliefs. However, a sudden exigence arose. False teachers had secretly slipped into the community. This dangerous internal subversion forced Jude to completely abandon his original plan and pivot to a fierce, defensive polemic. He utilizes the specific Greek verb apagonizesthai, which means to agonizingly contend or to fight vigorously, much like an exhausted athlete in a brutal wrestling match. He is commanding his audience to actively and fiercely defend the truth against these infiltrators. Jude's letter masterfully demonstrates how ancient rhetoric was incredibly adaptable, capable of pivoting on a dime to address the immediate, pressing, and life-threatening needs of the early Christian congregation. Let us take a closer look at the specific nature of the crisis that provoked such a strong response from Jude. The title for this section is The Exigence of Jude and the Antinomian Infiltrators. We begin with our first foundational quote. The primary exigence animating Jude's rhetoric is the covert infiltration of antinomian teachers who pervert the grace of God into a dangerous license for blatant immorality. To fully understand and appreciate the intense, almost aggressive tone of Jude's letter, one must clearly comprehend the magnitude of the threat. The exigence, the urgent, driving problem, was a specific group of individuals who had infiltrated the church secretly. These false teachers are best described as antinomian. This theological term is derived from two Greek words, anti, meaning against, and nomos, meaning law. These individuals essentially argued that because God's grace is infinite and forgiving, the moral law no longer applies to believers. They took the beautiful, liberating concept of divine grace and perverted it into a twisted license to engage in whatever sinful behaviors they desired, particularly sexual immorality, without any fear of divine judgment. Jude rightly recognizes that this specific kind of teaching is a deadly spiritual cancer that will inevitably destroy the Christian community from the inside out. It represents an existential threat to the survival of the early church. How does Jude counter this? Let us read our next academic excerpt. Jude employs severe vituperation and invective not merely to insult, but as a calculated rhetorical mechanism to alienate the audience from these dangerous figures and protect the community's integrity. When reading Jude, modern readers are often shocked by the harshness of the language. He refers to these false teachers as blemishes at your love feasts, shepherds who feed only themselves, waterless clouds, and wandering stars. This intense, poetic name-calling is known in the study of ancient rhetoric as vituperation or invective. To our modern sensibilities, it might sound uncharitable or overly aggressive. However, in the Greco-Roman rhetorical tradition, vituperation was a highly respected, formalized strategy. The primary goal was not simply to vent personal anger, it was a highly calculated attempt to completely obliterate the credibility of a dangerous opponent. Jude uses these vivid, terrifying metaphors to shock his audience into realizing the catastrophic danger posed by these infiltrators. He wants to construct an absolute, impenetrable boundary, completely alienating the church members from these teachers so they will immediately stop listening to their toxic lies. It is a necessary rhetorical strategy designed to protect the vulnerable flock by viciously and publicly exposing the wolves. We will now delve into the specific argumentative structure Jude utilizes to condemn these infiltrators. The topic is typological syncresis in the Epistle of Jude. Let us consider our first major analytical point. Jude's most prominent argumentative strategy is a typological syncresis heavily reliant on Jewish apocalyptic texts and Old Testament history to frame the current crisis. We have already discussed syncresis, the powerful rhetorical tool of comparison, in our analysis of James. Jude also employs this technique, but he utilizes a very specific, highly theological variation known as typological syncresis. Typology is a method of interpreting history where past events, individuals, or judgments serve as types or established patterns that directly foreshadow and explain present or future realities. Jude digs deeply into the Hebrew Bible, and even draws upon well-known Jewish apocalyptic literature such as the Book of Enoch, to find undeniable historical examples of rebellion against God. He takes these famous, terrifying stories from the past and superimposes them directly over the current crisis in the church. He is explicitly comparing the present false teachers to the most infamous villains of ancient scriptural history. This is an absolutely brilliant framing technique because it relies heavily on the audience's deep reverence for the scriptures and their understanding of divine justice. Let us see the application of this in our next text. By aligning the current false teachers with notorious historical rebels, such as Cain, Balaam, and Korah, Jude demonstrates that their impending judgment is a matter of established divine precedent. Jude utilizes a famous, terrifying triad of ancient rebels: Cain, who brutally murdered his own brother out of jealousy; Balaam, a compromised prophet who sold out for financial gain and led Israel into gross immorality; and Korah, who arrogantly and disastrously rebelled against the divinely appointed leadership of Moses. Jude looks directly at the false teachers polluting his church and declares, "Woe to them! They have taken the way of Cain, they have rushed for profit into Balaam's error, they have been destroyed in Korah's rebellion." By constructing this typological syncresis, Jude is doing something of immense rhetorical power. He is fiercely arguing that the fundamental character of God does not change. Because God decisively and utterly judged Cain, Balaam, and Korah in the past, it is an absolute, ironclad guarantee, a divine precedent, that he will also execute terrifying judgment upon these current false teachers. Jude leverages the weight of sacred history to assure his audience that God remains absolutely sovereign, and that wickedness will ultimately face unavoidable justice. Moving forward, we will examine the profound emotional impact deliberately crafted within these texts. The subject is the function of pathos and vivid natural imagery. Here is our first major observation for this section. Throughout both epistles, the authors deploy an intense reliance on pathos, utilizing vivid, evocative metaphors derived from the natural world to deliberately stir the audience's deepest emotions. In the classical tradition of ancient rhetoric, a skilled speaker relied upon three primary modes of persuasion: ethos, which is credibility; logos, which is logic; and pathos, which is the direct appeal to the audience's emotions and passions. Both the Epistle of James and the Epistle of Jude lean extremely heavily into the use of pathos. They do not merely want their audiences to intellectually assent to their theological arguments, they desperately want them to feel the profound weight and urgency of what is being said. To accomplish this, they employ incredibly rich, evocative, and sometimes terrifying imagery drawn straight from the observable natural world. James, for instance, compares the doubting individual to a turbulent wave of the sea, relentlessly blown and tossed by the wind. He likens the wealthy, who fade away in the midst of their pursuits, to a fragile flower withering under the brutal, scorching sun. Jude similarly describes the false teachers as hidden, jagged reefs, waterless clouds swept along by chaotic winds, and dead, uprooted autumn trees. These are not merely pretty poetic flourishes or decorative language. They are carefully engineered rhetorical images designed to paint an indelible, emotional picture in the listener's mind. What is the ultimate purpose of this intense imagery? Our next quote explains it perfectly. This powerful appeal to pathos serves to break through spiritual lethargy and provoke an urgent, visceral response to the respective crises threatening the early Christian congregations. The overarching goal of utilizing all this intense natural imagery is to shatter the audience's dangerous apathy. When James vividly describes the scorching sun destroying the beautiful flower, he intends for his listeners to feel a genuine sense of dread regarding the foolishness of trusting in temporary material wealth. When Jude speaks of wild, churning waves of the sea casting up the foul foam of their own shame, he intends for his audience to feel a visceral, righteous disgust toward the immoral false teachers. This strong appeal to pathos is absolutely necessary because human beings are rarely persuaded to make difficult behavioral changes based on cold facts alone. We must be moved emotionally. By tapping into their deepest fears, their inherent sense of justice, and their profound reverence for God, James and Jude are attempting to violently shake their congregations out of their spiritual lethargy. They are utilizing raw emotion as a powerful, necessary engine to drive the deliberative behavioral changes they are demanding. As we approach the conclusion of our seminar, let us examine how Jude masterfully brings his intense letter to a close. The topic is the doxological conclusion and pastoral reassurance. Here is a beautiful summary of this final rhetorical maneuver. Jude concludes his fierce polemic with a soaring doxology that functions as the ultimate rhetorical peroratio, bringing the intense deliberative discourse to a majestic and triumphant close. The vast majority of the Epistle of Jude is characterized by dark, terrifying warnings, severe historical judgments, and fierce, unyielding attacks on the antinomian false teachers. It is a heavy, burdensome text. But right at the very end, in the final two verses, the tone undergoes a breathtaking, miraculous shift. Jude breaks out into a magnificent doxology, a theological term that simply means a short, exultant hymn or expression of absolute praise to God. To Him who is able to keep you from stumbling and to present you before His glorious presence without fault and with great joy. In the structured terms of classical rhetoric, this soaring praise serves as the peroratio. The peroratio is the grand, final conclusion of a speech. Its fundamental purpose is twofold: to eloquently summarize the main argument, and to leave the audience in the precise, carefully calibrated emotional state the speaker desires. Jude has spent the entire letter making his audience hypervigilant, defensive, and perhaps even a little fearful of the insidious deception surrounding them. But as a good pastor, he absolutely does not want to leave them in a state of paralyzing panic. Let us consider our final quote for this slide. This climactic expression of praise refocuses the audience's gaze from the threat of the infiltrators to the sovereign keeping power of God, providing profound pastoral reassurance amidst the eschatological crisis. This concluding doxology is a stroke of absolute pastoral genius. After relentlessly warning his congregation about the catastrophic dangers of apostasy and falling away, Jude forcefully lifts their eyes up from the immediate threat and points them toward the heavens. He powerfully reminds them that while the threat of the false teachers is entirely real and deadly, the sovereign keeping power of God is infinitely greater. The false teachers might desperately try to make them stumble, but God Almighty is fully able to keep them from falling. The imagery dramatically shifts from the terrifying gloom of darkness, rebellion, and impending judgment to the blazing, victorious light of God's glorious presence and great joy. This doxology provides immense, desperately needed pastoral reassurance. It definitively reassures the faithful believers that their ultimate spiritual security does not depend solely on their own fragile ability to fight off heresy, but rests entirely on the unshakable, sovereign grip of a loving God. It is the perfect, triumphant, and emotionally resonant conclusion to a desperate, urgent sermon. We have now arrived at our final slide for today's comprehensive lecture. The concluding theme is synthesis, masterpieces of deliberative persuasion. Let us examine our concluding thought drawn from the academic text. Ultimately, applying rigorous rhetorical criticism to James and Jude rescues these foundational texts from being marginalized as minor, disjointed ethical tracts. For a very long time in the history of biblical scholarship, the Catholic epistles, especially James and Jude, were somewhat marginalized and looked down upon. The great reformer Martin Luther famously dismissed James as an epistle of straw, simply because he did not perceive the same kind of deep, systematic theological arguments in it that he so admired in Paul's letters. Many scholars have incorrectly categorized these books as just random, haphazard collections of moral advice, somewhat disconnected and secondary to the real, weighty theology of the rest of the New Testament. But as we have conclusively demonstrated in this chapter, when we apply the precise, historical tools of rhetorical criticism, our entire perspective completely changes. We stop reading them as disjointed, flat essays and start hearing them as powerful, cohesive, spoken sermons. We realize that the authors were highly skilled, brilliantly trained communicators who knew exactly how to capture an audience's attention, build a devastating logical argument, and drive home an undeniable point. This leads directly to our final, summative text. Instead, this analytical approach illuminates them as sophisticated, urgent masterpieces of early Christian deliberative persuasion, crafted to navigate acute community crises and enforce strict theological and moral fidelity. This is the ultimate, essential takeaway from chapter 9. James and Jude are not minor, secondary works, they are absolute masterpieces of deliberative persuasion. They were not written in an ivory tower, they were forged in the intense, chaotic fires of real-world congregational conflict. James was fighting a desperate battle against the creeping, corrosive hypocrisy of double-mindedness and catastrophic wealth disparity. Jude was battling for the very eternal soul of the church against antinomian infiltrators who threatened to destroy the gospel of grace. They utilized diatribe, syncresis, enthymemes, and raw, powerful emotional pathos to desperately persuade their brothers and sisters to stay true to the demanding path of the gospel. They weren't just writing abstract theology, they were performing emergency spiritual triage on early Christian communities on the brink of disaster. By deeply understanding their rhetorical genius, we gain a much profounder appreciation for how they fiercely and successfully defended both theological and moral fidelity in the first century. Thank you for joining me on this rigorous deep dive into the rhetoric of the Catholic epistles. I trust you have found this methodological approach as enlightening and transformative as I have.